Good evening, everyone. You're in the right place at the right time. This is Coast to Coast AM, blasting out of the Mojave Desert like a Scirocco, blazing across the land, slamming into your radio like a supercharged nanoparticle of unobtainium. Greetings from the boldest, bawdiest, most outrageous city in the world, the planetary capital of sun, fun, sin, sex, and secrets, my not-so-humble hometown, Las Vegas, Nevada. My name is George Knapp, your occasional host, designated driver of the airwaves, and moderator of tonight's upcoming cacophonous cavalcade of conversation. What's shaking out there? A crisp, cool evening here in the desert. February's been cold by Las Vegas standards. I mean, not so much by the standards of most of you listening tonight. We're ready to be done with winter here, such as it is, and for the next 4 hours, we have a rock'em sock'em UFO throwdown with a slice of paranormal on the side. In the first hour, investigative journalist Leslie Kane is here. You'll remember Leslie as one of the 3 reporters who broke the huge UFO story in the New York Times back in December 2017 that changed everything for this topic, turned it on its head, got other mainstream media to pay attention, got Congress to sit up and take notice, helped usher in so many changes that are playing out right now as we speak. Quite a month for UFO news, right? Even if the UFOs in question turned out to be balloons that escaped from a used car lot or a hobbyist group or whatever it was. Regardless of what you might think about Balloonapalooza, there are some distinctly positive after effects. I mean, did you see that White House press corps sit up and ask pointed questions, strangely enough, then demand the release of videos from the planes that shot down these 3 unknown objects? I mean, hey, better late than never. Leslie is definitely one of the people who helped kick so much of this into gear, and she's back with a new and ambitious project, a documentary series about UFOs, UAPs, and the central figures in the unfolding of this mystery, both historically and currently. It's airing now on National Geographic, and it's excellent. We're going to jump right into that just moments from now. Then in hour 2, and for the rest of the night, one of my favorite writers and investigators of all things strange, Paul Stonehill. He's written extensively about UFO events behind what used to be called the Iron Curtain in the former USSR, but also in China and other parts of the world not so accessible for Western media. His YouTube channel is jam-packed with videos and info that you just don't see anywhere else. You know, we Americans tend to think that everything revolves around us, including the biggest mysteries of all, but right now, this month, in multiple spots in Russia and in China, they're seeing and reporting some of the same phenomena that have baffled our pilots and sensor systems in recent weeks. We'll hear the latest from other parts of the world, plus dig into some very strange takes that Paul has dug up. The Yeti creatures of Mongolia and Tibet, for example, mysteries of Antarctica, a lot of ground to cover. Paul Stonehill joins us a little bit later and for the rest of the program. 2 sad notes to report tonight. 2 members of our extended family here on Coast to Coast passed away this weekend. Richard Belzer, a Serbic comedian, popular actor, frequent guest here over the years. He wrote and read about all manner of conspiracy theories, JFK especially, UFOs. He went down a lot of rabbit holes along with us, and he really knew his stuff. He passed away at age 78, and I read his last words are ones that I cannot say here on the air. You can probably find them online somewhere, and they're very appropriate for him. Another loss, Robbie Graham, a UK writer. He knew so much about UFOs and the movie biz. Silver Screen Saucers was one of his books. I interviewed him here about it. I interviewed him a couple of times on the show. Got to meet him at a conference in Denmark one year. He's a young guy, I think 42, very bright, excellent writer and editor. His friends say he's battled depression for years, and it finally got the best of him, and now he's gone. Both of those men will be missed by their fans around the world. Our webmaster Lex and I have pulled together our usual assortment of items and oddities culled from news media around the world. We call it Knapp's News, and you can find it on the Coast to Coast AM website. Among the stories there tonight, the latest updates on these, quote, mystery objects that were shot down in recent days. The search for wreckage, not going so well, or so we're being told. Big surprise. And there's a new piece about UFOs and nukes from the guy who got that ball rolling, Robert Hastings. Turns out he helped arrange first-person testimony to the new Arrow organization at the Pentagon from some of the service members who saw UFOs hovering over and interfering with our nuclear weapon systems. Very serious stuff. Check that out. Also there, an odd story about the death of Edgar Allan Poe. Still a lot of questions about the strange circumstances in that tale. You should check it out, those stories and more in Nap's News. And while you're on the website, you can see how to become a Coast Insider. The cost is about 15 cents a day. If you subscribe for a year, gives you access to a vast archive of programs and interviews, including the Art Bell Vault. You can listen anytime you want, as often as you want. It's a great deal. So, too, is a subscription to George Norrie's television program, Beyond Belief, wherein George interviews fascinating guests on a wide range of topics, similar to what he does here on the radio. With that, let's assume the position. Bring in the dog and the cat and the family chicken, put on a pot of joe, slide your bod into those warm flannel jammies and your toes into your best bunny slippers, plop yourself down in a comfy spot, turn down the lights and turn up the radio because we're about ready to rumble. In a moment, journalist Leslie Kean. I'm George Knapp, and this is Coast to Coast AM. Leslie Kean is an investigative journalist who helped break one of the biggest UFO stories of all time back in December 2017 in the New York Times, revealing the existence of a previously secret UFO program inside the Pentagon, and along with two now well-known videos of strange objects encountered by U.S. Navy pilots. She's written two best-selling books, one about UFOs, the other about surviving death, and is now one of the principal producers on a new documentary series airing on the National Geographic Channel. It's called UFOs Investigating the Unknown. The first two episodes have already aired. They're top-notch. Leslie, welcome back to Coast.
Hey, George. It's so great to be with you. What a great introduction you do for your show. I couldn't believe listening to that. It was fantastic.
I get away with as much as I can, Leslie. I don't know how you pulled this off, but, just as your series is about to make its debut 2 weeks ago, bang, boom, bam, a Chinese spy balloon gets shot out of the sky, and then three other unknown objects get blasted as well. And as a result, the whole world is looking skyward. Everybody's talking about UFOs, including all of our media colleagues. Nice trick. How did you do that?
Yeah, I know. So everybody's saying, how did you time this so perfectly? I think I orchestrated the whole thing just for publicity, George. No, it was just a pretty amazing coincidence, and I hope it means more people are curious and more people will watch the show. I just want to add what you said about National Geographic. It's also going on Hulu. So it only airs on National Geographic for one night, and then it goes up on Hulu for people to watch indefinitely, just so that's clear.
Good. Yeah. We'll have more details about how people can see it. I watched it today online. It's terrific. The first two episodes were just excellent. Let me ask you this. After that New York Times story came out, there was a flurry of other media coverage, mainstream media at last. But then the pushback started, sniping from rivals of the Times. A lot of big guys that got kind of lost interest. Then the pushback came, some in your same paper. Can you tell me how you felt when you saw sort of recent stories in the Times that kind of took the other take on it, and that were clearly seemed to be pre-bunking the report that was coming out to Congress?
Yeah, I mean, the difference is that, the reporter who wrote those stories is a full-time staff writer for the New York Times. He writes on national security issues, and I don't know him. I have no idea what his perspective is. The difference is that I'm actually a freelance writer, George, and maybe people don't know that means I'm actually not working for the New York Times. But when I have a story for them, I will pitch that story to an editor there, and they will either say, yes, we'll do it, or no, we won't. But I'm not assigned stories, and I really don't know the workings of that paper in terms of how stories by other people, are put forward by other reporters who work regularly for the Times. And, clearly the individual you're talking about has a different perspective, I believe, or a different approach to the story, let's say, than I would take and my colleague Ralph Blumenthal would take. So it's just, I have absolutely no input or relationship or say in anything that goes on in that paper. And all I can do is just keep trying to get stories out that I think are, really, really covering something important.
Well, I don't want to box you into a point where you have to criticize the Times, because maybe you're going to want to pitch another story to them at some point. But
exactly.
I think in your show, you cover just how hard it was to get that story on. And I've talked about it in public before, about what a heavy lift it was for you and Ralph and Helene Cooper to pitch that and to get it through to those editors, because the New York Times, at least since 1960, has been overtly hostile to this topic, in my view. You don't have to say that. I'll say it. But,
no. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it's a heavy lift, right?
It was a heavy lift. I think, the interesting thing was it wasn't that hard to actually convince the editors at the Times to run the story, because we really had the goods. I mean, we had documentation, we had the videos, we had Lou Elizondo on the record, and others on the record, people who confirmed the ATIP program, et cetera, et cetera. We really had some solid stuff. And they're interested in what goes on at the Pentagon, right? So here was like a secret program at the Pentagon, but it really depended also on getting Harry Reid, your good friend, George, to come on board in the story. And they greenlit the story, but we kind of had to get Harry Reid. So once Helene Cooper flew out to Las Vegas and talked to Harry Reid, and he confirmed everything that was, as we said in our series, her words, he confirmed everything. And then we knew we really had a story. But so the challenge was more about dealing with the editors in the process of writing the story. It wasn't so much convincing them to let us do it. There have been other situations with Ralph Blumenthal and I where we have had trouble convincing them to let us do something later on. But that initial story, they were smart enough to see that was something big. But, it's a struggle to deal with the editors because they take so much control over the story. They don't let you say certain things that you might want to say. They make you say other things that you don't want to say. And it's just and you have to pick your battles, too. You can argue certain things, but you can't argue everything. It's a really delicate balance and a delicate dance. And in that respect, it was very difficult, that first story, just to get through the hoops and the vetting that we had to get through and the control, basically. I mean, to be honest with you, the control that they have over what goes into that story and how it's worded. It's very tightly scrutinized.
Well, your new series, I mean, I love the journalistic angle on it, how you went about putting the pieces together, how you got it past the editors. It's like a little bit of All the President's Men in that sense. It's a true story about journalism in action. I love that stuff. I just wonder.
It's fun because you're a journalist. You've been through it more than I have. So
were you? Talk to me about when that story exploded and the months that followed. How much? I guess you resist being too prideful, but how proud you were about other media picking up the ball and running with it, at least for a while. It slid back a little bit, but a lot of what's unfolding right now is traced right back to that story, isn't it?
Yeah, I would say. I mean, and that story really traces back to the resignation of Luis Elizondo, which is what set the whole thing in motion. But yeah, I think it's like a snowball effect. We start with that, and then it rolls down the hill, and it gathers more and more weight to it, right? And it just keeps building and building and building. And yeah, those first few months, it was just very, very exciting because I've been reporting on UFOs since the year 2000. That's when I did my first mainstream story in the Boston Globe. And I mean, I'd spent those 17 years battling the taboo, really, and just trying to make the simple point that UFOs are real. I mean, it just seems so elementary now. And that was still not an elementary point before that story came out, as you know.
Yeah.
And so now, it's just been amazing for me to sit, not only the first few months, but the whole ride, to just watch everything change. Whereas the point, the fact that now that there's an acceptance and acknowledgement by our official world here that UFOs are real seems almost kind of passé at this point. But George, remember? I mean, before 2017, that was not accepted.
And as you know, you
Yeah.
explore in the series the ups and downs of this topic over the years. There have been other times where the public was engaged, Congress was engaged, and then the genie somehow gets stuffed back in the bottle.
Right.
I guess, can you talk to me about the series, what you set out to do, how it got going?
Yeah, I mean, it really was a couple of years ago. This film company I work with called Breakthrough Films, which is based in New York, and I've done other projects with them. I did a series with them for Netflix based on my other book, and Surviving Death. And, everyone can see that this topic is of great interest. So we put together a proposal which went to CNN, actually, to just do this kind of broad sweep. And it's really designed a lot of it's designed for people who don't know a lot about this topic. So CNN had this vision, and as we did, of reaching all these millions of people on that network who just watch CNN but don't really know much about UFOs. It wasn't really made for the people who know a lot about it, although I think it's still interesting to people who know something about it. But that was the idea. Let's bring this out to a massive audience. And I think, and CNN was really behind it. They basically, funded the whole thing. And then what happened last summer was the CNN had some issues after it merged. There was this big corporate merger, and they shut down their documentary film department. So they're no longer airing shows like ours. So fortunately, it went over, as you mentioned, to National Geographic and Hulu and Vice and Disney Plus. They're all one entity. But that was basically how it happened, and we just spent a lot of time, running around the country and doing our interviews. And a lot of my job was to help write the questions for the interviews, help bring people into the series, help shape the story and determine, what was credible and what wasn't, and that kind of thing. And I just think, we're just hoping that it's just a way of kind of broadening a kind of basic level of information for the general public who knows there's something going on with this. And they know something's different now, but they don't quite know the subject matter very well. So I think that's what's good about the series.
Well, I like that it weaves in the historical stuff with current events. I mean, so the historical stuff that people, new people are drawn to this topic every day, and there's a steep learning curve there about how we got to where we are now. That some of the documents that hooked me in the beginning, the Twining memo, the Robertson panel, you tell those stories.
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
You tell those stories in a really interesting way. It's compelling. I mean, it's dramatic how those things unfolded.
Well, thanks. I still think it's dramatic every time I see it, even though I know it so well as you do. But I think a lot of people don't even know Project Blue Book ever existed. We all kind of take that for granted because we're involved. But when you think about the average person, if you went out in the street and asked people how many people know about Project Blue Book, they don't. So, yeah, I think we did try to weave it in a way that makes it really interesting. You don't just get bogged down in sort of this endless footage from the 1950s and 60s, but it's all integrated. And we do one of the episodes coming up is about all the work that citizens have done. It's not just about the government, but we have an whole episode that sort of focuses on once Blue Book shut down in 1970. Look at all these great citizen activists and investigators who kept it all going, who did all the work, collected all the documents, year after year after year. And so we're not just dealing with the government, but I like the fact that we're also covering the work of great people that are just out there doing it. And some of the groups like MUFON and CUFOS and filmmakers like James Fox, we're just giving a tip of the hat to everyone. And so I think people will identify with that as well.
The documents, it can be the kiss of death in a TV news story. You don't want to show too much of that stuff, but the documents are really compelling. That Twining memo that you mentioned early in episode 1 is pretty key. I mean, those are what grabbed me in the beginning when I was first chasing this, because as a journalist, that's something you can follow, the paper trail, right?
Right, exactly. Now, all those documents that were released during the 1970s, there's hundreds of documents on UFOs, as you know, that were released. And some of them I find to be the most compelling information we have, as I'm sure you do, like the Twining memo that you mentioned, and other memos, the 3-page description of the Iranian case that took place in 1976, that long, detailed transcription, a briefing of what happened during that event. Phenomenal. Yeah. So, there are some documents. I mean, people say, has disclosure happened? I mean, it hasn't really happened in the way people want, but those documents really established the reality of this long before our government ever admitted it. It was all there in the document.
It's very important for people new to the subject to understand the history of the secrecy and the debunking. I mean, you mentioned the Robertson panel created by the CIA, and they had a problem. UFOs were not a threat to national security, they decided, but the reporting of them could be a threat, could clog up our system. So they needed to debunk them, strip them of their aura of mystery, and they enacted what amounts to a policy of ridicule and debunking.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, what's phenomenal about that is that it's right there in black and white in their document. It says the word ridicule and debunking. We're going to infiltrate the media and documentary films, and we're going to infiltrate citizen groups. And we're going to, they call it education was another thing, which they define as meaning explaining away as many cases as you can by mundane explanations, So, it was a policy. And it's just fascinating that they wrote it all down. They didn't write it. Nobody got to read it at the time because it was classified. But in the 70s, when that was released, we can all see it exactly that they consciously laid out this policy.
It worked, too. We're talking with Leslie Kane. Yeah, we're talking with Leslie Kane about UFOs, investigating the unknown, new series that she's produced, and we'll come back and jump into some of the details about the first 2 episodes here on Coast to Coast. We're talking with Leslie Kane about UFOs, investigating the unknown, new series that she has co-produced. And as we learned in this series, and also key to her original story in the New York Times, Senator Harry Reid played a huge role in both. Because he had came forward and admitted that he had helped sponsor this secret program, came up with millions of dollars to fund one UFO program that turned into more than one over the years. As I've said on this program before, I had a sort of an ongoing secret private conversation with Senator Reid for 30 years about UFOs and tried to keep him engaged with the topic. I think he made only one public statement in all the years that I talked to him about it. That was back in 1989, because his staff, as Leslie reports in this new series, his staff told him, hey, this is not a good idea for you to talk about. But he finally came forward, spilled the beans. It made all the difference to that New York Times story, and it makes a big difference to this series. We're going to talk a little bit more about that and Lou Elizondo and Tom DeLonge right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Leslie Kane, is your series, is it all airing on National Geographic, or just the first couple and then it moves to Hulu, or is it on both?
It's on both, but just the way it works, George, is that Monday night, 2 episodes are aired on National Geographic. So tomorrow there'll be episodes 3 and 4 on National Geographic, and then the day after they move over to Hulu. So episodes 1 and 2 are already on Hulu, and then episodes 3 and 4 go on Hulu on Tuesday this week after they air Monday on National Geographic. And then the next week, the last episode goes on National Geographic on Monday night and on Hulu the next day.
Well, I can tell you, episode 3, we'll talk about episodes 1 and 2 in a moment. Episode 3 sounds like it's getting into UFOs and nukes. And I mentioned earlier in the program, Robert Hastings had put out this article today that he had personally helped escort a number of these former service members to talk to AARO, the new organization within DOD that's investigating UAP. I think it's a really important step. I mean, as you obviously know, the UFO and nuke angle is one that's strangely been ignored by a lot of the media coverage of this over the years, and it's as big as it gets. If that's not national security, what is?
Exactly. I agree with you. It's very, very important, and I'm just thrilled that many of them are going to go speak to AARO. A couple of them already have, or at least one that I know of. So, yes, and they seem to be taking it very seriously there. You're right. It has been neglected. I think part of that maybe because most of the events happened, decades ago, but still, as you recall, one of the Congressman Gallagher asked a question at the hearing last May. The congressional hearing asked that question about one of those events. So one at the Malmstrom Air Force Base, I believe, was 1967. And the 2 gentlemen who were who were the witnesses at that hearing didn't know anything about it. So that's amazing. That needs to be made a lot more part of the dialogue now, and I think it's starting to happen.
Episode 1 begins with the Tic Tac, which is, I think you could probably easily say that's the most important UFO case of all time in one sense, in that the effect that it has had, how well it is documented, the credibility of those witnesses, Dave Fravor, Alex Dietrich, Chad Underwood, that you interview for this episode. I mean, it's a really powerful case, and I loved how you describe and demonstrate the movements that the Tic Tac was making during that encounter. It really takes away the argument this is a seagull or glare or flare or any of that baloney.
Yeah, I think they hired some very good graphic artists to demonstrate how the Tic Tac was. And I think an episode, maybe it was later in episode 1, I didn't remember, they showed the difference between an airplane cruising over the state of Ohio and a UAP making the same turn but at a right angle. I don't know if you've seen that one yet. It may not be in one of those first 2 episodes.
I don't remember seeing that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's just some. I think you're right. I mean, I think that and again, I'm not responsible for this at all, but I just think the visuals, the way they were handled in the episode, really clarify a lot of the imagery that people have heard described. They haven't actually seen it. So I think, and I agree. I thought it was really appropriate to open up with that case because, as you mentioned, it's so important and so well documented, and people have heard of it. So it lets people tune into something they're sort of familiar with.
The reaction to Tic Tac, to the video. I mean, as you note in this series, the fact that you had the video of Tic Tac and then Gimbal, it made all the difference in the world to go along with the testimony of the aviators. Very powerful combination. But you still have people, even today, that want to say it's seagulls or flare or glare or something that, to make those kind of arguments, you have to assume that our pilots are nitwits, are knuckleheads who don't know how to read their own instruments or don't know what to see with their own eyes. It's
I
ridiculous.
mean, I agree, and I think you have to also assume not only that they are nitwits, but that the analysts at the Department of Defense who got the video and analyzed it as well as it could ever be analyzed by any technicians, and were forced to acknowledge that these were unknown objects. So that you're also saying that they're idiots, and that maybe some guy, who's just sitting there on his computer feels that he or she can do a better explanation than the Department of Defense. Well, I just don't think so.
As you say in the series, getting Harry Reid was a really big deal. It was critical to having the story in the New York Times go forward, and it's a really critical component of your series now, especially with him being gone. But was there any interest in the New York Times in those days of maybe nailing Harry Reid, that maybe he got this $22 million authorized as a favor to his pal in Nevada?
Yeah, well, they didn't. I mean, some people have raised that as sort of a criticism. Oh, the only reason Robert Bigelow got the contract was because there was a special relationship between him and Harry Reid. I don't personally believe that's the case, and I don't think the Times did either. I mean, whatever, they were satisfied with accepting the fact that Bigelow went through the process to apply for that the money that was offered by Harry Reid for this program, and he was the best qualified person to do it. And I don't think there's any doubt about that. So I don't think that there was any special favors there. I just think what was appropriate was what happened.
I know Helene Cooper tells the story in the documentary that once she got that interview and the confirmation from Reid, she's like floating on air. Holy cow, this is an actual story. We're going to be able to get this on, right?
Yeah, I loved her. I mean, I think my whole favorite part of episode 1, George, was Helene Cooper, because she has not done any interview like that ever before. She's not normally out there. She's not a UFO person, And I just thought she was hysterical and really genuine in the way she described going to Costco. You remember that?
Yeah.
Oh, she just said, okay, we're done with the story. It just went up. It was the Harry Reid thing, too. It was a really big deal, and she was so thrilled when she got it. But also, when the story actually finally posted, and we were trying to beat Politico, who was trying to beat us, she just put her phone in her pocket and casually went and did her shopping at Costco. She describes walking out of Costco, just casual, I'll just check my phone. And she said it was absolutely exploding. And this was only like an hour after the story had posted. Her phone was exploding. So, yeah, I love the way she described it.
The only bone I have to pick with it is about Senator Reid. The $22 million that he got was for something other than ATIP. It was called OSAP. It was a program running out. But I know you couldn't do that story. None of us could at the time that the Time story came out. Right.
Right. And I'm just so glad that you all did the book, George. I mean, that you and your colleagues, Jim Lukatsky and
Colin
Kelleher. Yeah, I mean, that book, and I talk about that book all the time in interviews because people are always asking about the paranormal aspects of the phenomenon and how it interacts with consciousness and other aspects of the broader scope of what UAP actually are, which I think, that book is absolutely crucial to make that point, and it's a major, major piece of work. So I agree. It was not something we could bring in at the time, and I think if we had, it
might have killed your story, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think, we could have mentioned the name of the original program, but I think the editors felt it was going to be confusing to do that. It's like at some point, you just don't argue with them anymore. It's too frustrating.
Yeah.
I
understand
that. Yeah. So, but I think the work that you have done to get out what actually happened with that program is really, really important. And I think the timing of when you did it was also really important.
I like how
now.
Yeah, I like what you do with Elizondo. Lou is it really tells the story from a personal perspective of what he put on the line to make this happen. If he had not come forward, I don't know that we'd ever learn this. Also, Tom DeLonge. If Tom DeLonge hadn't put TTSA together with Chris Mellon, with Hal Puthoff, and had a landing spot for Lou, I mean, who knows how this would have gone.
I agree with you. I mean, yeah, that's right, because I think Lou might have had I don't know if he even would have resigned if he didn't have the Tom DeLonge umbrella to go under. I'm not, but maybe he would have, but it made all the difference for him at that point. To have that group to go into and to have the support of his colleagues in the To the Stars Academy was really, really important. Yeah. And I think one thing we did in episode 1 was to try to show some of Lou's personal history and who he is as a human being and why he did what he did, and try to really reveal some of all of that, So I like that too, and I think I have the greatest respect for Lou Elizondo, and I always will. And I'm sorry that so many people are giving him a hard time.
That comes with the territory in UFO world. But what bothers me the most is that his former employers continue to give him a bad time, playing games at lawyerly language of he had no assigned responsibility, or ATIP wasn't a UFO program. I mean, it goes back and forth. It's shameful for a guy who really did serve his country for so many years.
I completely agree, George. I hope it stops. But he's writing a book now. He's had some time away from all of this. He's been sort of quiet, and I think he's probably feeling good about that.
The early investigations that you cover, the developments that I think are so important to understanding the big picture, that the Air Force wanted to go away. And in some ways, you almost feel sympathetic to them in that they were, as you document, they're overwhelmed with UFO reports in those days and really didn't feel like it should be their job to do this scientific investigation, right?
Yeah, and I think you have to really remember that this was during the Cold War, so that really exacerbated it. They did not want Russia to know what we were up to. They didn't want UFOs to be misunderstood as some kind of object from Russia. They didn't want Russia to be able to take advantage of this in any way. There's all this fear around being in the Cold War that I think made it a lot worse. And yeah, I mean, all of a sudden they were dealing with this phenomenon that they knew, I believe they knew, was not man-made back then. And what did they do? It's almost like they were green at the time. That you get that feeling they just didn't know what to do. So they set up this program called Project Blue Book, in which people could file reports. But it really became just this effort to kind of debunk and ridicule and kind of quiet down all the interest that people had, which was spelled out in that Robertson panel report that we talked about. So, yeah, I mean, the Air Force really just sort of muddled through the whole thing, and they were very happy, I believe, when Project Blue Book closed down in 1970. That was the end of it for them. But
and then,
it's a different world now.
Well, some things are different, and some things take a long time to change. In episode 2, you return to a really important case that people have forgotten, that this will help them remember, Stephenville. So there's a reporter, Angela Joyner, who I got to know a little bit and interact with and interview, working for this small-town newspaper, gets the story of a lifetime, and there's pushback from her editors, too, after she makes this big splash with a story about this UFO incident that the military initially lied about, I think in 2008. And she basically, she loses her job because she doesn't want to give it up, right?
Right. I mean, she was really heroic in that regard, and such a wonderful character, I think, in the series. And I mean, in life, she was just so lovely and so invigorated by this. Yeah. And she realized how important it was, and her editors were not into it at that time. So as you say, she either quit or she got fired. As I recall, I'm not sure which it was, and she wasn't completely clear about it. And then she just went out and just carried on with the work. And there were so many witnesses in Stephenville who wanted to talk to her. Without her, George, I'm not sure that story would even be very well known today.
I know.
MUFON got involved. There's a long report done on it, a long study done on it. It was a very, very important case.
So this, I don't remember seeing this in the episode 2, but wasn't George Bush's home overflown by this thing or something close to it?
I remember that. And I wish I could remember the details. There was something about that it overflew one of George Bush's facility, homes or something out there. And then there were stories about jets chasing it, and then the Air Force denying there were any jets up there, but then later having to admit it. I mean, it was pretty incredible. Unfortunately, I wasn't that involved with that case because when that case happened, I was writing my UFO book, and I just sort of missed it. I'm so glad that we covered it. I wasn't that involved with the coverage of it in our series, but there is this sort of surprise reveal that I absolutely loved, and I'm sure you did too at the end
my
of
gosh.
episode 2 with the editor. I don't know if we should say what it is because it's so moving and wonderful for anybody who watches this episode 2 to see what happens to this editor who was the one who gave Angela Joyner a hard time. She was the one who made it impossible for Angelia to cover it at the paper that she was in control of. And she went through this transformation, and I don't want to give it away, but it's pretty spectacular, wouldn't you say?
Yes, it is. It's a great way to end that episode. Tell me this, big picture stuff.
In the series. Yeah.
We have a couple of minutes left. Big picture stuff. So, it's amazing the changes that have happened in just a few short years. I know I get a lot of people who are new to the topic who think that the pace is so slow and when are we going to know? And I want to know right now everything. But the pace of change that I have seen is absolutely extraordinary over the big picture. But do you think the genie can be crammed back in the bottle now that Congress seems to be fired up? I don't know if you're spending any time on the Hill or talking to people who are, but there are some of those folks who are definitely into this topic and don't seem like they want to let it go.
It seems that way to me, too. There are certain members of Congress, certain senators that do not want to let it go. And I'm grateful for that. And there's probably others, not so much in the Congress, but elsewhere that that would like to put a lid on it. But it really seems like the momentum is in the forward direction, is in the direction of, letting Arrow do its work, letting Congress interview the people that they want to interview, collect the information, verify, follow up on things that these people are telling them who have only been able to do this now because of legislation. I mean, George, the fact that legislation was even passed is phenomenal. That's, allowing these people with these security oaths and these agreements that don't allow them to talk about these things to actually now talk about them to the Arrow, to the people at Arrow, and to provide information to them about black programs and reverse engineering and all these things that can be followed up and verified by these DOD officials, by members of Congress. And then what's going to happen when they figure out they get let's say they get verification of something like that. Of course, then the big question is how much of that will be made public.
Yes.
But even so, that's a watershed moment. If it even just happens with one program or one incident that's absolutely definitive.
Well, I think you're hearing the same.
What do they do?
I think you're hearing the same stories I am about the whistleblowers who have already come forward and told them about legacy programs, about materials and craft, and whether or not that gets made public. Well, I'll tell you what, Leslie, we'll just promise to make sure it gets out one way or another, right?
We'll just have to make it happen, George, and you're doing it already.
Leslie Kean.
So.
Thanks so much for being here. Congratulations on the series UFOs Investigating the Unknown on National Geographic and on Hulu. Check that out, folks. It's really good. Thanks, Leslie.
Thanks for having me, George. Take care. Thank you.
All right. Paul Stonehill joins us to talk about paranormal and UFO incidents from other parts of the world. Paul Stonehill is an international researcher and author whose areas of research and published works include UFOs, USOs, Soviet space exploration, and Eurasian paranormal phenomena. He's developed really great sources and media connections all over that part of the world and is focused on features that are on his YouTube channel. And it's information you really can't find anywhere else online. An amazing array of stuff involving Russian history and Soviet covert operations, warfare in the former USSR, paranormal stuff that'll chill you to your bones in Eastern Europe and Russia and Central Asia. He's got some great current cases and incidents and paranormal episodes and encounters, some very similar to what we've been experiencing here in 2023, and he joins us momentarily. Welcome back. As I said at the top of tonight's program, Paul Stonehill is one of my very favorite writers, researchers, investigators on UFOs, USOs, and paranormal. He covers cases and incidents and material that no one else in the world covers, puts it on his YouTube channel. I spent several hours there today going through some of the most recent entries. Paul, welcome back to the program. Are we hearing Paul Stonehill there? Paul, you there? All right, we're trying to get Paul back on the phone here. as I mentioned, he's got this YouTube channel that covers UFO incidents, and the first thing that jumps out at you in looking at the first couple of entries there are the similarities to what's going on here right now. These unknown objects, 3 of which were shot down in recent weeks by U.S. Air Force planes. The Russian military has been going through something very similar to that. They've had a number of incidents this month. They also had some similar cases in January. And then it turns out that the Chinese have been having similar episodes as well. Now, we've heard from Chinese media reports that they think these are American balloons, that they're blaming us for doing the same kind of thing that they were caught doing with that Chinese spy balloon that was shot down off the East Coast. I think that Paul Stonehill is going to be sharing with us information of a different nature. Do we have Paul back? Because he can't get him. All right. We're trying to call him back now. In addition to the UFO stories that we're going to be covering with him, he's has great media sources for stories about paranormal events that are just not reported in Western media. For example, one of the things we're going to be covering with him tonight is the sightings of Yeti-type creatures, abominable snowmen, all over Central Asia, Eurasia, Tibet, and Mongolia. Some of these cases it would really be a great addition to have in Western literature that looks at Bigfoot and similar creatures here. But Paul is the only source for them. I'm hoping we're going to get him back here on the phone momentarily. Okay. All right. So I guess we're going to have to just open up the calls to our listeners now, because I don't know where else we're going to go here. We got Paul, who was scheduled to join us for 3 hours. He was on the phone a minute ago, and he's telling us, hold on a second, I'm going to forward this message to Donna. Okay, he is back. Well, that was going to be a long 3 hours if I had to just ramble on. Paul, are you there?
I am here, and I got to tell you, I'm not too happy because I was holding on, and then the call was cut off, and my computer froze up, because I want to look for the backup stuff. Anyway, let's talk. We'll see how it goes.
Well, yeah, we're good. We're all good. I was just telling the audience as I was stalling there that there are some similarities to the cases that have made so much news here in the West and North America, these shoot downs of these mystery objects, and things that are happening in Russia. Let's start there. What can you bring us up to date with for cases that you've reported on your YouTube channel this very month?
Unusual cases of swirling, rotating dots appearing over areas like the Leningrad region, not far from St. Petersburg. And the Russians actually, dispatched aircraft to check it, to chase it, but nothing came of it. They're not shooting anything down, even though it's the wartime right now. But very unusual cases, and all over Russia, actually. We know that some of them have to do with, whatever launches they're doing at the time, but some cannot be explained. They're trying to explain them away, but those very rapid dots appear in the sky and disappear. And they know it's not satellites that belong to Musk, but Elon Musk. I've had cases from several areas, but especially very interesting is the Northwest Russia, St. Petersburg area cases. And definitely their military is worried. Also, there was a case, and I'm going by memory, George, because like I said, my computers, I'll try to restart it.
Sure.
Now, there was a very interesting case late January and beginning of February when actually the aircraft that belongs to the FSB, which is the modern KGB, they observed a UFO object, right appearing as the course of the aircraft was laid, and also they tried to check it out. They didn't know what it was, but whatever it was no drone, and the object knew that the FSB special aircraft on special missions was in flight. So they're very confused as well. They're trying not to show it, and things are happening just like in the United States.
So you report on these things that you called it St. Petersburg, also known as Leningrad, in this region. And according to what your information comes from, is the airspace was closed over a 200 square kilometer area after something was detected in the sky. What were they seeing? It's lights?
There were lights, dots they mentioned, and quite suspicious in character. And they tried to explain it away by regular explanation, but they could not. And one of their top pilots in the area said, "Listen, I've been chasing UFOs under the Soviet times, and when it was not proper to even to report it, so we know what it is. It is a UFO," and he was alluding to it being of non-terrestrial origin. There's only so much they can say. So they did close the airspace for a while. Everybody got worried, and people took pictures and so forth. But then they reopened it, and they used all kinds of special signals. They called it cover or regime, different areas of Russia. And again, military aircraft was dispatched.
Are you surprised that an incident involving something from the FSB, which is sort of the successor to the KGB, that an incident involving that plane would ever make it into a media source in Russia? What's the media environment like there? Does the press have certain freedom, or do they get in trouble for spilling secret stuff like that?
Well, they'll find out. If they go against the line, they'll find out. But Russia is no Soviet Union. I mean, yes, there is a lot of control nowadays, and they're attaining certain Soviet characteristics, but still information goes in. And Russia is not a uniform state. I mean, you can find out a lot of interesting information reading Siberian newspapers and even local newspapers in European Russia. Komsomolskaya Pravda is one of the newspapers I've been using for many years, and Putin is he likes that newspaper too. Well, I like it as well because they, despite their ideological bent, they do publish a lot of cool stuff about the investigation into the Dyatlov Pass or the continuous coverage of the cosmonauts and developments in the Soviet space industry, and of course UFOs as well. Vladimir Logovsky is one of their top scientific journalists. I've been in touch with him since 1991 and exchange information. So you do get interesting stuff. You just have to sieve through it and just make sure that it's not tabloid media. But you get good news from Russia.
I know you do. You have great sources, and you understand the language and everything, and you have cast a very wide net there. I just not much of it makes it out here unless it's from you, right?
Yeah, and this is very sad because Russia and China are not being covered as they are, and there is you can see a lot of nonsense that is somehow leaks into the Western press, but that's understandable unless it's a special disinformation operation, and I don't know who to point to cast Russian UFO research and previously Soviet UFO research as nonsense. Well, somebody is afraid of the information that's coming out, and the more people are finding out in the West or Far East and so forth that Russia has had many UFO instances and reports, and they're somewhat similar and somewhat different from the United States, you find out that quite sober and intelligent people have been researching this phenomenon behind the Iron Curtain and now in Russia. And you start putting one and one together. And you can see that despite all the swamp gas explanations and all other things that is being thrown at us, the phenomenon is out there, UFOs and USOs, and you can't shut us down.
So it's a lot like here in that sense, in that the official explanations, that's balloons, that's probably drones. You've mentioned that in a couple of the reports that I watched today.
Yes.
Yeah, it's drones, that's Starlink and something like that. But the explanations that come from the official sources are not believed in a lot of cases.
No, they're not believed, and it shows you that those at the top are running around like chickens without heads and trying to come up with feverish explanations as to what UFOs are, balloons and this and that, and missiles are being expanded or spent to shoot down objects like that. But you cannot shoot down the phenomenon; it's out there, and I think it's becoming more and more prevalent for a reason I cannot comprehend. But it's out there, and maybe it's the times that we live in, strange wars, strange sicknesses, who knows?
It's kind of scary, I would think, to be a journalist in Russia because you don't exactly know where the line is. You and I have talked about it before when we've had conversations here that, in previous decades, UFOs were forbidden. They were regarded as Western propaganda of some sort, so the research went underground, and then it's been back and forth. After I was there in the 90s, some of those people who spoke to me on camera openly, they wouldn't talk to me again when I went back a couple years later. So I didn't know what it was like now. We read about a lot of people falling out of buildings and having terrible accidents when they cross Putin, and I know that some journalists have met bad fates there, so it strikes me as kind of risky to go too far on this subject.
It is nowadays, of course, everything changes, and you get into, again, state-controlled territory. But it's not only in Russia. What's interesting about the Soviet Union, yes, UFOs was as a forbidden subject for many, and people got burned for independent research. The freedom came with Gorbachev. He was a great man, and he brought freedom to the subject of UFOs. In 1989, the chains came off. We had a cool period until 1994. You know that because you were there as well. But after 1994, everything was being clamped down. And I am not sure that it was only because that's how the modern Russian government wanted. I don't think that I know that they don't cooperate together with other world governments in trying to put a lid on UFO information. And this is what's scary, because even though the chains on the subject of UFOs existed in the Soviet Union, they published books by American debunkers in the Soviet Union. I think they had a very touchy relationship with the governments in the United States and maybe later China that came in. I think the exchange goes at the very highest levels. They understand each other. And maybe the situation with confusion over the UFO subject and USOs is welcome at the very highest levels. Yes, it's not easy today to be a journalist in Russia, and many of those who don't agree with the situation have left. But a subject of UFO is different. UFOs, USOs is completely different from the political situation in Russia today. It's always out there. It's a minefield.
Could you go there? Would you worry about what would happen if you went there?
I would definitely worry today if I went there. Although, yeah, they've translated my book into Russian. They know me. They refer to me and so forth. But right now, I would be very much afraid. 2 years ago, no. Today, I think everything changed.
Can you give me a sense of what the reporting has been like in Russian media about our current events here? Are they reporting on the spy balloon and the mystery shoot-downs, or are they laughing about it? What do they take? What's their take on the whole thing?
It's not that they're laughing, but they do report, and they want to say very interesting. Well, first of all, there's some crude reporting and comments by people who say, well, the Americans are doing it to make money, this and that. It's the Americans are trying to excuse their conduct by shooting down balloons and taking our attention away. But the most interesting is from specialists and experts who say, look, they think it's balloons and they shoot them down, but balloons nowadays should not be used for espionage operations when you have other means to do so. And they recall, justifiably so, that how many balloons were sent to the Soviet territories to spy on the Soviet Union, which was done, everywhere. And they were being shot down. I even have videos about Soviet pilots who, still alive, come out and say, listen, we were sent to shoot down a NATO or American or West German balloon, and at the same time we noticed this very unusual donut shape, I believe, if I recall, UFO. This was like in 1980s. I know people, there were organizations in Western Europe who used balloons to send in leaflets into the Soviet Union as well. So they're very cognizant of balloons, and they don't believe that, there is a necessity to send balloons nowadays over Russia to spy. You can use satellites. So they are also very confused. And I recall when all this development started in the United States with new organizations, government-sanctioned organizations to study UFOs, military and otherwise, they were quite, I would say, sympathetic to that. And they said, we understand, and we look forward to the findings of the U.S. Army about UFOs, this and that. It wasn't really hostile.
Huh. One of the mentions that you make in your most recent videos is of this air defense being activated January 29th. The crews were notified of the air defense. They send up planes in response to this thing that was seen by the FSB aircraft. But two other aircraft saw these unusual lights at the same time, right?
Yeah, two local regional aircraft were seeing the lights at the same time as well. There was a number of incidents late January, beginning of February, and then it would jump over to February 13, 14. They had seen a number of interesting objects over Russia. And again, I wish I could get to my. It doesn't matter what it was. Some of the specialists report saying, well, it's not really. It couldn't be a drone. It's just inexplicable. They said like it's an unusual force of nature that we don't know yet.
That's a good quote. That's a good quote. We're talking with Paul Stonehill about his research from Russia, China, including USOs, UFOs, paranormal cryptid creatures. When we come back, we're going to let him have time to get his computer booted back up. But we're going to talk about some Chinese UFO incidents reported in Russian media. Now that our phone problems have been resolved, we'll continue our conversation with Paul Stonehill in a moment. We've been hearing about a couple of recent incidents, January and February of this year in different parts of Russia. Something similar has been reported in China as well. And when we come back, we're going to go to a region I'd never heard of before. It's called Karelia. It borders Finland, a land of 60,000 lakes and dense forests where paranormal and UFO activity have been sort of a hotbed since 1928. We'll be right back with more Coast to Coast AM. Paul Stonehill, I want to jump to your recent report about this area called Karelia, which is, I guess, borders Finland. 1/4 of it is covered by lakes, 60,000 lakes, but it's what goes in and out of those lakes that really caught your interest. Tell us about it.
Well, the Karelia region is, mostly it was Finland before, a very interesting part of Russia. It has ancient history going back to a few thousands of years. And since 1920s, there is a lake, Vedel Ozero, and there is a village nearby, and they have been observing strange celestial phenomena. Bright orange spheres that are basically are exploding in front of their eyes, so to say, flying around. For 3 hours, for example, recently they observed similar phenomenon, bright shining sphere flying over them. What's interesting is that since 1928 they have this phenomena because there was an object, I recall it was a cylindrical object that fell into that lake, and the KGB of the time became interested in NKVD. They surrounded the area. They forgot. They told the people not to forget about it, not to talk to, but people talk to because, for decades something appears over their area, and multicolored circles flying in the sky. But so also again spheres and I'm going a lot by memory. There was a a strange creature observed. I think it was about a meter high. It was skinny. It had a pronounced head, protruding head. And what's interesting, it was dressed in something like a space suit that you could go to, or like the divers were. And the people got used to it because it wasn't bothering them. And of course, the government is trying, and the scientists trying to say that no, you are seeing special light effects, maybe because of the technological experiments or new testing of new equipment, maybe aircraft or drones. But we didn't have that in 1928, so that doesn't work. People in the area talk about very unusual, mysterious stories, and observing a number of flight, like raspberry-colored flight, a sphere flying around, and it scared people, but it didn't harm them. The gigantic gigantic sphere separated into smaller spheres, which is common to many reports about UFOs in the area. And this is going on. I think in 2012 there was a very interesting sighting around that lake. And it's like small yellow triangles were falling down, and other geometrical shapes and spheres. And it comes from a number of people about that lake. But this is not the only lake in Karelia that has had this experience. You got to understand the whole area going towards Leningrad, or now St. Petersburg, and the lakes like Lake Valaam, like Lake Ladoga and Onega have had stories about UFOs and USOs continuously. And Russian researchers have paid attention, such as Mikhail Gerstein and others. They're paying attention to what's going on and trying to explain it. But really, there is no explanation. If we go back to the 18th century, in 1716, there was an observation recorded by Dutch diplomat / spy about celestial battle over St. Petersburg, basically, when cloud-like but solid formations basically ran into each other, and there was a celestial fight. And it was observed by the Russian Navy. Admiral Sinyavin, as I recall, he also saw it from the other side. So this area is full of interesting phenomenon. And I urge you to pay attention to the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea itself, and, of course, the Russian territories. Now, Petrozavodsk is not that far away from there, and in 1977 they had very interesting sightings correlated with the launch of Soviet satellites, but they had sightings before, during, and after. So you can't hang it all on Soviet satellite testing. There was a strange jellyfish-like object over Petrozavodsk in Karelia, not far away from St. Petersburg, and the biophysical effect on people was very pronounced. They had gloominess, they felt bad, they had physical reaction to it. What's interesting is that the windows in the houses and the buildings around the city had small apertures all of a sudden opening. There was more than that. I just want to underline to you that Karelia and the nearby areas are very interesting. And those who study my research, they will also find out that this is the area, not far away from there, like Kola Peninsula and around Solovetsky Islands, where the ancient labyrinths, like the Minoan Kingdom, unusual labyrinths or mazes are found, which are inexplicable. Some of them are also found in nearby Sweden and so forth. How it all ties in together, I don't know, but it's out there.
You know, Petrozavodsk, that incident, it's been explained by debunkers as, oh, yeah, that's just that jellyfish. That's because of the rocket launch. But I've got those photos. Colonel Boris Sokolov, the head of the Ministry of Defense UFO investigation, gave them to me. He said that there was something else going on, and that incident is what prompted the Ministry of Defense to establish its 10-year-long UFO study that encompassed the entire USSR military and collected thousands of cases. That was what really kicked it off.
Absolutely. That's where the Setka came from. This was what scared the Soviet Union. And people need to understand, it wasn't like Brezhnev said, okay, we're going to start a new program. No, it was the Military Industrial Commission that got together, and the Communist Party leaders authorized it to start the research. And the Setka research, which you had brought documents about, which is great because there's not that much of them. There are some, but they're still classified, most of them. But something is out there. This program lasted for 13 years. They had used the entire Soviet armed forces to collect information and bring forth reports. Do you understand the situation mentally, what we had in the Soviet Union? You cannot talk about UFOs. UFOs are bourgeois inventions or nonsense, and that's how it's accepted in other countries too. But at the same time, you had, meaning military personnel, had to collect information about UFOs and USOs and send them to two special centers for the analysis of such information. And the incredible cases came into their possession. Kazakhstan, something happened in Arkhangelsk, the so-called Arkhangelsk dust. I still don't know what they refer to. They had captured something, and I don't mean captured, I would say something came into their nets, collection nets. I know we talked about the area not far, again, Karelia. Well, let's talk about the 1987 case in Monchegorsk, which Gorbachev knew about because he changed his itinerary to go see a small shuttle-like object that was delivered to the Setka Research Center because it was discovered outside a military facility, again, not far from Leningrad. They tried to open it, the Soviet military researchers. It was a small shuttle-like object made for little people, so to say. They were able to get in. They messed around. They broke a few, I think one piece for sure. And then they had radiation burns on their hands, those military researchers. Whatever was inside was not made for human beings like we are, but for smaller statue. They couldn't understand what the controls were. Finally, they studied the object. They rolled it out, and then it either exploded and vanished or disappeared, causing damage to the military facility as well. This is also in the Setka files, one of the least understood cases, but it's out there. And again, Gorbachev knew about it. This was the Setka program that you brought documents about to the West, and that very few people talk about here.
Before we leave Karelia, there's one of the details that you reported I thought was really interesting. So the scientists try to explain some of these incidents away. Oh, no, that's just the northern lights that these rural people are seeing. And there's a newspaper who reached out to some of the locals, a teacher who lives there and spent her whole life there, responded and said, look, these are yellow triangles, rectangles, and spheres. It's not the northern lights. And she started telling very detailed stories about the things they had seen, including about creatures. And I like the idea that the people who lived there, living out in a rural area, weren't going to take that, and they fought back.
People are fighting back. Through the whole history, even of the Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, people who comprised the country were fighting back. We had resistance all this time, and I honor those people. And it can take many forms. You can go out and bring leaflets, you can form underground parties, or you can just do what Solzhenitsyn asked people to do. Do not lie. When you don't lie, this is first form of resistance, and people do speak out, even about this. And I've continuously read, responses to the articles in Russian media like Komsomolskaya Pravda, and that brings me a lot of information because people say, look, I was at such and such age, I was here, and there, and this is what I had seen, and I want to talk about it. The situation right now is that people who had lived in the Soviet Union are dying out. We're all getting older. And kudos to those military officers and commanders who come out and say, I don't want to be silent anymore. Even though I gave oath of non-disclosure, I do want to talk about what I had seen. Military, like admirals and generals, they say, what do we have to lose? I want to talk about it. And that's how we get very interesting information. And I put it in my research as well about cosmonauts or about admirals who said, well, we were on a secret mission by Greenland, and we saw this object burst through the ice from down below, from under the surface of the sea. It burst through the ice, and it was, it was a missile-like object, or it was a UFO, this and that. But we knew that it was no Americans doing that. And some Russian generals that I bring in information from, like one who was fighting the Chernobyl disaster, helping people survive. He was a real hero. And he said, we are surrounded. We are controlled by aliens. After many years, he was a completely sane guy. He said that. He says, you don't understand the extent of the phenomenon, but I'll speak out about it. And nobody can silence them.
You also report of Russian media reporting on UFOs over China. And this happened February 14th, Valentine's Day. UFOs were spotted near the border of Russia and China. I don't know if you recall the details off the top of your head or whether you have that on your computer, but what do you know?
It was reported in a Russian newspaper, and yes, in northeastern China, right next to the Russian border, that the UFO's lights were lights were going in and out, and the Chinese people down below took photographs, and some tried to explain it by being masked satellites, but they knew it wasn't like that. It wasn't that, and it actually made to the Russian, I can't pronounce the name of the newspaper right now, but it made to the Chinese newspapers, and there were interesting photographs out there. But the date, February 14, is the same date that there were sightings in Russia. So there must be a correlation somewhere. Has it happened in other parts of the world? I am sure, over the United States probably. But this was no balloons, no satellites, just strange lights that appeared over China. And I think from world media, there were reports of maybe 1 week before, there was an object sighted over Shandong province, right next to the sea. It was familiar to me. There was an object, UFO, sighted in that area as well, which could not be explained.
How hard is it for you to get information out of China? I don't assume that you speak or read Chinese, but so you would rely on Russian publications to report what's going on in China, or how do you get the information?
There are very cool newspapers out there, like South China, I believe South China East Reporter in English, very interesting ones. But usually I rely on Russian information because they're very cognizant of China. And their neighbor is of concern to them as well, and vice versa. So they are reporting very diligently on events in China. And it's not tabloid newspapers. Really interesting. Also, I read a lot of Russian regional newspapers, and they do have interesting news in the Far East. And we talked for years about Dalnigorsk, for example, newspapers from that area, from the Primorsky Krai or the Maritime Province. And the Russians also have pretty good, accurate, newspaper coverage from newspapers like Komsomolskaya Pravda, Argumenty, and Fakty of their neighbors' UFO activities.
And how much freedom does the Chinese media have to report this? You mentioned of Western newspapers that are printed, I think that South China newspaper is, I think, kind of Hong Kong and maybe Macau. But the Chinese people, did they get to read about UFO incidents? Is there an intense interest in the topic there?
There has been a tremendous, intense interest in UFOs. And they are using the Chinese government, I believe, is sponsoring UFO organizations and researchers. There are debunkers as well, but mostly they are very serious about the research. I remember from my lectures in Hong Kong in 2012, how the reception I had. And but nowadays I think it's even more serious because they want to know what's going on in correlation with the United States and so forth. But the Chinese UFO, the history of ancient aliens and UFO sightings in China goes back, I would say at least 6,000 years, to the days of the Yellow Emperor and the legends of his helpers, which could be described as modern-day robots and machinery. And it goes through the centuries, and we don't know everything that the Chinese know. They have ways to conceal information, especially in modern Red China or People's Republic of China. Nevertheless, there are organizations, I'm not sure how active, of ufologists, and they had tried to reach out to others in the world. I don't know what kind of action it was, but then it was clamped down. It stopped. However, within China, there is reporting on UFOs, and it kind of it goes into Russian media finds out about it because they have Chinese-speaking people, and that's how we find out.
We need to figure out how to go there and crack the code and get some of the UFO secrets that the Chinese must have, Paul. We'll talk about that off the air. Talking with Paul Stonehill. When we come back, I wanted to get into some of the psychic research, the psychic warfare research that the KGB did. Paul has dug up some interesting information on that, an interview with a Russian KGB general. And then we're going to go down to Antarctica and hear about some mysteries down there. Into the heart of things with my guest, Paul Stonehill. I mentioned he has a YouTube channel that has a ton of videos on it. Really interesting stuff. If you haven't seen it, check it out. I know we're going to be covering a lot of other ground here tonight, including psychic warfare. Now, if you know anything about the U.S. psychic warfare program, the CIA and other agencies spent a lot of money over a lot of years trying to develop psychic warfare capabilities, psychic spies, in essence. And it was in large part in reaction to what we thought the Russians were doing. We thought that they were way ahead of us on that kind of research and practical applications of psychic abilities. And they were right. The Russians were ahead of us. In fact, the next segment we're going to get into with my guest, Paul Stonehill, is about a Russian KGB general who gave an amazing interview. I'd never heard this stuff before, but we're going to jump right into the thick of what he told the world about the psychic research program that the Russians were conducting. We'll be right back. Paul Stonehill, I've read a lot about the Russian psychic program. I met the General Savin and some of his the psychic people that were in part of his program back there in the 90s. And but boy, this interview that you posted, this video you posted about this General Sham, I'd never heard that before, and it was pretty astonishing. Tell us who he was and what he revealed to the world.
General Sham was deputy head of the scientific and technical counterintelligence of the KGB of the USSR. He knew the essence of a lot of things that were concealed, of course, in the rest of the world. And thanks to him, actually to Pavel Popovich, former cosmonaut, anyway, the KGB released 124 pages of the previously classified UFO files that they had collected. So he is a historical person. He knows what he is speaking about. And not that long ago, on December 20th, during the Day of the Chekist, or the Day of the Special Security Officers Day, celebrated in Russia by certain people, he released a very interesting interview. It had some more stuff, something that I've not heard before, and I've collected information about this for years. But basically, he talked about people with special abilities. Very much interested. There was very much interest in them from the KGB, and there was a lot of bureaucracy involved as well. And I'll start from the beginning. He mentioned the Boki research of the late 1920s or 1930s, when the early KGB was also interested in this psychic phenomena, using psychics for espionage and so forth. And we spoke about Karelia. They had expeditions to Karelia to find out the special psychic state of the local tribes who had used it and they had tried to use it for control over masses. Very interesting stuff, but Stalin put an end to it. He executed the secret KGB department that was engaged in paranormal phenomena, and until mid-1960s, nothing really was happening. But then it started, and there was a movement within the KGB to attract people with special abilities, to train them
Are you there? I think we lost him again. Okay, so we're going to try to get Paul back. I want to recap my part of the story about the Russian psychic program. So when I went over there the first time in 93, it was mostly, there he is, he's back. Paul, you back there?
I am. Very interesting how we get cut off all the time, but that's okay. Listen, so they use people to use them for counterintelligence activities, and some of it in later years was actually implemented around President Yeltsin. They had former KGB people like Rogozin, Korzakov too, who had created departments, a special department to help psychic research to help Yeltsin. But before that, there were interesting cases of the KGB using psychic spies, so, for example, to test out like Czechoslovak communist leaders in the late 1960s who came to the Soviet Union to feel them out, whether they were lying or not. They allegedly used the same in their invasion of Afghanistan before that to check out, local leaders and to influence some of them to resign, hand their post to somebody else, to another one. And they also used the interesting couple from Vinnytsia in Ukraine. They used them to spy on Margaret Thatcher, allegedly using their biofield actually to move through space and time. Very interesting. They were present at Margaret Thatcher's meetings, and they could actually collect information and give to their centers. So prospects were incredible, but you also had bureaucracy who did not want to be bothered with this. So that's why some of the keen, insightful people in the KGB couldn't do as much as they wanted to, because the Soviet Union was not a monolithic totalitarian state. It was fractured. The GRU did not like the KGB and vice versa. And Yuri Andropov, who was the head of the KGB for many years, he had a keen interest in aliens and UFOs, for example. So all this was interconnected. But the psychic, from what I know from open sources, I want to underline it, they were very much interested. In the Soviet times, an entire research program was developed, and they used about 20 scientific institutes to study the psychic phenomenon. And a special group was created within the KGB to prepare people for such work. And then I describe special equipment that they use, so-called chairs with backrest and measuring equipment that they use. This is only some of the just information that we know. But according to General Sham, in general, the leadership of the KGB of the USSR did not care about their work. All they care about was their behinds and not to lose their positions like a bureaucracy. But at the same time, they didn't forbid this research. So they did collect within the KGB very interesting stuff. We just don't know how much they collected, because what was possible under Yeltsin, using Rogozin and others to give him horoscopes or to find out, clairvoyant ways to find out whether he should travel to Japan or not, anything like that. This did not work under Putin. All we know is that the department was shut down. I am sure he is using something else. It's just not being publicized.
You and I have talked before about the psychic program that I was in contact with, run by this general. All of the subjects were all women. He picked like housewives and people at shop clerks, things like that, because he wanted to demonstrate that everyone had these abilities, that it could be taught. So he would teach these folks who became very...
Of course. And women like Kulagina, there's a special gift that they possess, and it goes back to the ancient Greece and Cassandra and others. Of course. And the Soviets, they were no fools. They used old-time scientists from Tsarist Russia who were still alive, and like the Institute of the Brain of Degtyaryov's family. they try to find people with special abilities. Obviously, from what we know, they used women for a number of operations overseas, and we know about some of them, but most of them we do not. Yes, they use psychic abilities to the best of their capabilities, and they had even the Russian Ministry of Defense, according to General Sham, engaged in this area. There was even a laboratory that was created to search for people with paranormal abilities and work with them. But according to him, these were isolated cases. And logically it is so. Otherwise, they would have more victories than they do. He said that such developments have not been widely spread. Yeah, he knew people, for example, a group of specialists, that's very interesting, who were engaged in the use of weather management technologies. And they had equipment, for example, that could manipulate weather. But they were prevented to do so because it would make a lot of people unemployed. He said firefighters, for example, rescuers, and others would lose their positions. So those who protected them did not want this new abilities, new technology to be developed.
I saw a film that was made for the Ministry of Defense demonstrating the abilities that some of these Russian psychics had developed and been trained for. One of the films, it was a Russian warship. They put this psychic down in the bottom of a Russian warship, no windows, and they tasked him with finding submarines. Show us where on the map these submarines are, Russian submarines, and he did it. It was pretty impressive. So you can see how something like that, if it was actually reliable, would be a pretty powerful weapon to have. I think we lost Paul again. We're talking about this. Is he there? Okay. So the interview we're talking about is with this ex-KGB General Sham, I think it's pronounced. Paul, tell me this. Why was General Sham allowed to make this interview, put this information out?
Because the information that he's putting out is, they know that there are people in the West who know this. Not people like me who go to open sources, but at a much higher level. This is one reason. The other one, they always want to test out, the Russians, at the top command, they always want to test out the reaction in the West to such pronouncements. It's a game of cat and mouse. And trust me, Sham would have been in an old age home if he would not. That's not even a question. So they are allowing certain information to be leaked out and published. They are looking at the reaction of their counterparts in the West and China.
Wow.
And I don't know. I don't think it's done at the highest levels, but it's a professional thing. And also probably they're looking for ways to get more funds done. Though the Americans will look at the Russian achievements and say to the Congress, look, we need more money to study this phenomenon, and vice versa in Russia. I'm being cynical, but that's how things are.
It's true. So General Sham, did he say anything about aliens? And I ask in this context, the Russian psychics in that Ministry of Defense program, they would tell me that they're projecting their consciousness, something like what we would do with remote viewing, and they kept running into other beings, other intelligences out there, psychically, and I wonder if Sham said anything along those lines. I think we lost Paul again here. I don't know what we're going to do here because this is really starting to get kind of frustrating. I think it's the phone line. Well, we're going to try to get him back here. I was mentioning about how the Russian psychic program that I was involved with, they would train the women, mostly housewives, in something similar to what our remote viewing program had done. And some of them were specialists in medical diagnoses, using psychic phenomena to diagnose people's medical conditions. They did an experiment on me, and they're pretty darn good. And then the general who was running that program along the way said that his psychic subjects, who had been, after they'd been trained, kept running into aliens, psychically running into some other kind of consciousness and intelligence out there as they project their consciousness out into space. So I'm hoping that we get Paul back and we can ask him if that's exactly what came along with him. Do we know? Okay. One of the other things I want to get into with Paul is the freedom of academics to go ahead and study this. For a lot of years in the post-Stalin era, Russian academics who had an interest in UFOs were not allowed to speak publicly. Were not allowed to publish articles, things of that sort. But they were expected to study it and present publications and papers and research results behind the scenes to Russian party officials and to Ministry of Defense officials. In the 90s, when I was there, a lot of those folks were allowed to come out into the public and speak to the public and publish articles. It was a very liberating time during those few years that Yeltsin was running things, post-Gorbachev, Glasnost, Perestroika. So I got to speak to a number of the Russian scientists who, there was a professor named Varlamov, and another one named Simakov, who would go out on these expeditions to research what we would call UFO landing site trace cases, where witnesses would say, we saw a UFO land, it made impressions in the soil, sometimes burned plants, sometimes left radiation. They would look for evidence and collect it in much the way some Western scientists here in the U.S. would do, and they were allowed to publish the results, at least for a while. Are we still working on getting Paul? All right. So anyway, in the 90s, at least for a couple of years there, they were free to talk about it, free to speak to Western journalists. And so I want to see if Paul is familiar with that kind of research and whether it would be allowed to take place today. Paul, I don't know if you were able to listen to my diatribe there. I was asking about academic freedom in Russia today. Would a university professor be allowed to go out and study UFO landing site trace cases, that sort of thing, collect samples and publish it?
Lately they had a number of professors arrested, elderly people actually, and targeted as enemy spies because allegedly they turned over information to the Chinese and the Americans and others. And, those professors basically they just spoke about their work. They didn't turn over anything, from what I know. And I don't want to get them in any trouble. I think the situation changed. I think Russia is becoming much more autocratic. I think we see a lot of chaos there. We don't want to talk about politics on this program, otherwise we'll be more interrupted. But this is not. If we talk about ice cream, I'm sure production of ice cream, nobody will cancel my calls. But it's different now than it was in early 1990s. Those days are gone, and I feel sympathy for those in Russia who are trying to do their honest research and exchange information with their colleagues overseas. As for UFOs, I don't even see too much scientific interest as before, even in the Soviet times, in study of UFOs. During the Soviet times, there were groups of people who worked in Ukraine, in Russia, and other parts of the Soviet Union, who did everything they could to study UFOs, went out to the field, into the field to collect data and so forth, and they knew what they were risking. Today, no, it's a different generation.
You mentioned about Popovich, who came out with or released these KGB files that were just a huge story all over the world. His wife, Marina Popovich, the cosmonaut, also made some pretty dramatic statements here in the West about UFOs. Was there ever a downside for them? Did anything happen to them for having such a high profile on this issue?
No. But Pavel Popovich, he did not reveal everything he knew, and he kept saying that he gave an oath. Okay, but the USSR was gone. You are now Ukrainian. You can be in Ukraine, but he lived in Russia still. You don't have to hide this stuff, but he did. But he revealed so much stuff about UFO research in the Soviet Union. He protected ufologists like Azhaja, who died a few years ago, and others. He did
he provided roof over them. This is a Russian saying, krysha.
I'll tell you what,
meaning
Paul, we're
protection.
glad to have you back, but we need to take a break here now. Hopefully the phone line sticks with us. Our apologies. We appreciate your patience with the phone problems that we've had. We think the worst of it is over. And just in case, we're going to have the phone lines open so some of you can hang on and talk to us in case we lose Paul again. But we don't think that's going to happen. We have so much more to cover with him and so much that we still want to talk about, including cryptid creatures. He's got some great stories about dramatic encounters with unusual animals, creatures that we might call the abominable snowman or Yeti in parts of Central Asia, Eurasia. And we're going to hear those stories right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Paul Stonehill, of all the great videos on your YouTube channel, the one about these cryptid creatures, the Yeti sightings in the Central Eurasia, Mongolia and Tibet, might be the most impressive of all. I mean, these stories that you put together, this is a long video, but can you walk us into this and the kinds of tales that you've heard and where these stories come from, how they come to you?
I've been doing research of cryptids of the so-called abominable snowmen for decades, and even field research in places like Yucatan, because they have their own, Belize, Yucatan, they have their own stories. But Eurasia, especially areas around Siberia and Mongolia and China, have very interesting stories about the ape man, about humanoid-looking beings. Now, my latest one was about Dagestan. Yes, it's a very unique area in the northern Caucasus. And fantastic history, many paranormal phenomena in the whole of Caucasus Mountains. Well, they have been reporting creatures that are human-like in the area that were recorded from 1940s for sure, modern times. And one of the most interesting was the report of going back to 1941 about the KGB of the time, not the KGB, but the military counterintelligence capturing a being that they had actually executed, who was taller than a human being, more hair over him, all over the body. It was not responding to them. Not as a sentient being, but it knew that it was captured in a way, and they tried to interrogate it. Nothing came of it. It would not eat. It made some kind of strange sounds, but anyway, it was executed, and there was an eyewitness to it, a military doctor who spoke about it 17 years later, when it was more safer to do so. They also had, so that in the Soviet Union in 1958, there was a Academy of Science expedition to Pamir and other areas to study cryptids, abominable snowmen, Almasta. It had many names. And we had a French woman who became Russified, so to say, Kaufman. She lived in the Soviet Union many years, and she persistently studied those cryptids and had done quite a lot. So it was not a forbidden subject, but of course they had a lot of debunkers. They had to deal with scientific reluctance to study cryptids, but nevertheless, a number of scientists did. I'm especially interested also in stories coming from the northern parts of Russia, including the ones that I talked earlier about ufologies and so on, like Karelia, like Yakutia, mostly, or areas Chukotka, Kamchatka. They have stories about cryptids as well. Very unusual, powerful beings, usually covered with hair all over their body. Some of them actually captured human females and had children with them, but they were described as not sadistic or, violence probed. No, they actually cared for their human mates, and some of them, like in Dagestan, went back to the caves to live with their cryptid husbands
It wasn't the other way around usually. So that's very interesting. I mean, ask me what else would you like me to tell you?
Well, the point you make in this video, which is one of your longest videos, is that there are multiple cultures, multiple countries, isolated villages, people who all have their own slightly different version of these beings that are out there, but all similar in many ways, sort of ape-like beings, different kinds of descriptions and sizes, but generally pretty close to the same. And these people are not telling these stories because they've seen it in a movie or on a TV show. They're way out there in the middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah, they're secluded villages. Basically, those people are just shepherds for the most part, very poor but hardworking people, and they're not afraid to talk about this. But they're reluctant. First of all, they don't want to bring too much attention to these cryptids because they're dying out. And there's a sort of protection over them. There is fear as well in other parts of the former Soviet Union that I've met. But I don't recall cases of real violence against humans by these creatures. And the locals have established some kind of rapport with some of them and try to protect them, even from scientists themselves. Yeah, and like in Dagestan, you have 70 languages in that small country. Very proud people, very unusual paranormal phenomena in more ways than one, and cryptids. Kabargina-Balkaria as well, next door. And, there was a story also in the Caucasus about Zana, the female cryptid, female Yeti, who actually had children with a human man, with males, and they found descendants in the Caucasus area. They were already, I don't want to say normal, they were already human beings, but nevertheless they had some remnants of genetic material from the ancestor. And people know very little about the Caucasus. I want to tell you something, your listeners. Did you know that we have descendants of African slaves or people who were shipwrecked and settled in the Caucasus area? And they're African Abkhazians, for example. They're just like people from Africa, but they don't consider themselves. They say we're Abkhazians like everybody else. When I was a youth in the Soviet Union, I remember I was in that area. I've seen one or two people like that, but nobody knows about them in the West, as an example. Or people don't know about the other interesting paranormal phenomena in the Caucasus area, the dolmens, those unusual structures made by, allegedly, sentient dwarf-like beings from the, I don't know if we can say it anymore, beings from the sea who came to Earth, to the surface of the planet, and created those unusual structures called the dolmens. And you can see them in southern Russia. They conquered parts of Caucasia and Caucasian land. And they're just as mysterious as the ancient snowmen, that still is alive in the area. So if you ever have a way to go to Georgia or southern Russia or areas like Dagestan, you will find a lot of interesting things there.
I am not surprised that human men would go ahead and mate with a female Yeti. Yeah. That doesn't surprise me a bit. But you mentioned about other paranormal activity in the Caucasus. Like what? What kinds of other activity?
I would say definitely paranormal activity like those unusual dolmens, and also if you look at the Black Sea near the Caucasus areas, the reports of the giant sea serpent that had been sighted there, Crimea as well. Now, the Caucasus, archaeologically, it's an incredible area. It goes back to the Roman times. So there are a number of mysteries there because the Romans sent expeditions to research stuff, very interesting stuff in the Caucasus Mountains. UFOs have been prevalent in that area. I remember I did a video about UFOs in ancient Georgia, Kingdom of Georgia. They had one I believe it was in the year of 1238, which some people said was a comet. No, the comet doesn't last for such a long time over the areas. And it was a premonition of the Mongolian invasion into the territory. Very interesting. There were other observations of UFOs in Armenia, I recall, and other areas. Now, if we speak about Armenia, you can find ancient sky observatories in that land and reports of gigantic beings. This is one, I'm very proud of this. I found out about presence of giants, so-called giants, in Georgia. There's a cave that is sealed off, but there were gigantic beings with strange abilities, as far as we know, that are pertinent to Georgia, for example, and other areas. And it's a small land, Caucasus, but there's a lot, from snowmen, from abominable snowmen, to dolmens, to UFOs for centuries, and even the Amazons, which is not paranormal, but even the Amazons lived in that area that very few people know about, Azerbaijan and others. Very interesting stories about those female warriors in the area. So I try to bring more attention to that land. I've seen some interesting things myself many decades ago.
You want to tell us what?
Dolphins. And
dolphins.
This was dolphins in Abkhazia. I was out in the open sea with the local boys, and they told me, Paul, there are dolphins that the military is training there, but sometimes they swim out, and you can go and see them. And I did, but I didn't come too close. I was not a capable swimmer at the time, but the local boys were playing with them. And from what my research of the Soviet use of dolphins for warfare, did not include that part of the Black Sea, but apparently they also had something in what is today Abkhazia, formerly part of Georgia. So that's what I had seen in that area. When it comes to Black Sea, when I was a child, I'll never forget, I was able to go to one of the smaller islands, island in the named in honor of Lieutenant Schmidt, some revolutionary hero, and I was able to go down into the bowels of the island. They had excavations, archaeological excavations, and see what the ancient Greek polis looked like. But you know what? That island is so cool because they also found later remnants of Vikings and artifacts belonging to the Vikings, which, why would they be in the Black Sea in Ukraine? Vikings never traveled through there, but apparently they did. So it's all the geographical area is very interesting.
We'll take a call, try to get one in before our next break. We're going to the wild card line. Brendan in Austin, Texas. Hey, Brendan, you're on with Paul Stonehill.
Oh, my goodness. You caught me by surprise. Thank you so much. George and Paul, you guys are both heroes of your own right. You guys are amazing. Both follow them on social media and his podcast. And so my question, super fast. I'm sorry, Paul. I listen to your previous interviews all the time, so often. You're so awesome. I'm sorry. Okay. I got to calm down here. Report from Main Astronomical Observatory of the National Academy of Science from the Ukraine sent a paper to Harvard for peer review that's available for the public. Anybody can go and look at it. And as video, radar, and photos of UFOs from Kiev and a city outside. And we all know there's lots of objects in the air in war, the horrible, unjust war that's going on. I'm so sorry for that, Paul. And they said that they found dark UFOs absorbing light in the sky, and the others were bright. And some of them were traveling at 33,000 miles per hour. ICBM can only travel at 15,000 miles per hour. Rather than focusing on what the crafts are and where they're from, it was just mainly focusing on the calculations. So had you heard about that, or do you think it's legitimate? Have you heard of stories on the battlefield of soldiers seeing UFOs? And what of the submarine that hit the mountain under the ocean? Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you. And, I'm no hero. I'm a researcher. I know heroes in the former Soviet Union who risked their lives and their livelihood to study UFOs. I'm a researcher. I just like what I do. But get to your point. Of course, there are UFOs over the battlefields, and whoever is observing the battlefield, they're not hiding. They have their own interest. I don't even go into why they want to see warfare among human tribes, but that's what's going on. We had UFOs over the battlefields of Chechnya, and for years, it could not be explained. Now, UFOs have been sighted over Kiev, where I'm from, also for thousands of years. But after Chernobyl, we had a number of incidents. So Ukraine is just of interest to them because of warfare that's going on. As for the submarines, I remember the last interesting report I had about USO sighted by Ukrainian submarine, the one that was still functioning at the time. It was a joint Russian-Ukrainian expedition, and they sighted, I would believe it was 2006, in the Crimea. And I even have a photograph in one of my videos. And also I mentioned in my books. Very interesting. Yes. The Black Sea had a number of incidents with UFO sightings for decades. So it doesn't surprise me that things are happening in Ukraine right now over Ukraine. But believe me, it's not the only isolated area. You should keep your eyes glued to the China Sea, to the seas around China, Philippines, and so forth. Things are happening. The more there is action, so to say, the more there is warfare, the more there is interest from UFOs. And not only that, even the launches of spacecraft. We had academician Mintz in the Soviet Union who said, look, it feels like we are under a microscope because every time there is a launch of a spacecraft, from the Soviet Union, somebody observes us. There is a UFO observing us.
Paul, Brendan had mentioned this report that had been sent by some professors in Kiev to Harvard, in particular, that documenting some UFO activities. Does that ring a bell to you? Do you remember that? That report?
Yeah, it was a few months ago. Okay. I remember that report. I don't know if the professors from Harvard reacted it in any way, unless it's Avi Loeb, who is very prominent, I believe, in Harvard, a scientist from Israel who lives in the United States and is pushing more and more solid UFO alien research. So kudos to him. Maybe he can tell us something about it.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look that up. Thanks for that call, Brendan. We're going to go take a break now. When we come back, we'll open up the phones, see what's on your mind. Paul has a wealth of information about activity all over the world, but especially in the former USSR, Russia, China, Tibet, Mongolia, those areas where we get very little UFO or paranormal reporting anyway. And then I want to get into other kinds of weird activity. Do the Russians investigate poltergeist-type cases? Do they have anything akin to a Skinwalker Ranch, a hotspot where there are multiple phenomena being reported? We'll be back with my guest, Paul Stonehill. We're one more hour of Coast to Coast. We have 1 hour remaining with our guest, Paul Stonehill. Still a lot of ground to cover and a lot of interesting callers with cool questions on the phones already. We're going to get to as many of those as we can right after this on Coast to Coast AM. Paul Stonehill, I still have some questions. It looks like the KGB has given up its attempts to jam your phone, at least for now. But we'll go to the phone lines, and then I'll come back if we have time, and I'll dive into some of the areas I'm thinking of. On the wildcard line, Robert in New York. Hey, Robert, you're on with Paul Stonehill.
Oh, thank you, gentlemen, and it's a real pleasure to speak to both of you, Paul and Mr. Neff. I had the privilege of knowing some people that were in the aerospace industry and the satellite industry and so forth, and working with a satellite industry. So in any case, but I had some interesting experience with UFOs. We had a engineers UFO club many years ago, and many of them have passed on now. But we had some incredible guests also that spoke off the record and just to our private group. And As a matter of fact, one of the gentlemen was Ed Mitchell, astronaut,
Wow.
who became a family friend and so forth. And he had things to say that I can't really share on the radio here, but off the record, and it has never been publicly published. But also, I've had an experience with an orb, which a number of years ago, in the sky on a summer night, it was up in the sky. I looked out just to check on the weather because all of a sudden I noticed I had a window open with the screen in, and in the foot of my bed, and I went to look to see what the weather, because all of a sudden there was the insects, the crickets and the night insects were humming, shall we say, and then all of a sudden everything went dead silent, completely silent, not a whisper, and that was strange. So I looked out and I saw the lights way up in the clouds, but all of a sudden 5 or 6 of these round orbs looked like the size of a volleyball, but they didn't shed light on the whole area. They just glowed around. The light was a very bright yellow light, and they started to come down and drift. But they'd also, some of them would be blink on and then blink off and appear in another location. And some were drifting. They came down and pulled the apple trees down the mountain, and then I crossed. One landed on the top of a bird feeder, and then just stayed on and glowed, and it went around the corner of the house, and that fascinated me. And so I had my forehead to the screen and wondering what is all this about, and all of a sudden, one just appeared like a flashbulb right in my face. Like I was as close to an orb as anybody could get, the thickness of the screen, and it blinded me. It was like someone took a flash tube, and I closed my eyes, and I felt I could see my skeleton inside when I closed my eyes. It just felt like this being had just came right through me to shall we say, X-ray my brain or something of that nature. And and it scared me so much that I ran to the other side of the house to see if there was anyone else had seen it. And we did have another family member who did see him there, but actually my grandmother, and she said, hide, and put them on, because I was still semi-blinded by it. And she said, there they are outside her window. And she hid under the pillow and the covers, and she says, maybe they'll go away. But in any case, that has always haunted me in terms of when I hear about UFOs. And another occasion, years before, about 1957, above the hospital, and there's a mountain and a ravine by the hospital, and an 1812 cemetery from the soldiers of the 1812 there, across right on the side of the road, across the street from the hospital, and above that was a huge, gigantic orange sphere that hovered over there. And we were coming past through there, and all of a sudden the car stopped. There must have been 20 other cars along the side of the road, which all of a sudden the flashboard was flashing, and it went out. And even on my wristwatch, I think it was about 7 years old at the time, and looked at my wristwatch, and my wristwatch stopped. My watch had stopped, and I had just wound it before. And so, and even the dashboard on the car went blank. The car coasted to the side of the road. We were there for hours, and there was about 20 other cars that also experienced the same thing. And we got out and talked to the people, but this giant, huge sphere hovered over the road and the ravine across the street from the hospital.
Robert, let me ask you, Robert, did anybody report this? I mean, in later years, as you get older, did you go back to look and see, was this in a newspaper? Did anybody report it to MUFON or anything like that?
Well, that's very interesting. I did know a lot of people at the newspapers back, in our local newspapers, which inspired me to become, interested in journalism myself. And then again, with my godfather was a journalist and wrote some phenomenal articles and he was also a physicist, scientist, and so forth, and writing articles about the 12 poisons Monsanto's put in our food, and a lot of other interesting scientific articles he wrote. And so in any case, I'm just wondering if your guests had any knowledge about orbs as how they affect the physiology or how they affect people who have had experience right up close as I have. I've never met anybody. I've heard people that have seen them at a distance, but none of them that ever see them up close and personal like I had.
All right, let's hear what Paul had to say.
You were lucky to escape with your life intact, because I know a case in 1970, for example, in east part of the Soviet Union, when scientists observed a UFO, actually USO, coming from the waters up, ascending upwards, and those who had observed it, it wasn't too far away from them, they died. I think only one survived, and they didn't have, they died young. So sometimes UFOs observed very close can cause detrimental impact. As for the effect on the watches, yes, there was a case when UFO flew over the sea liner Shataru Staveli, and everybody on board had their watches stopped. They checked. It was a very strange UFO, a fiery orbit, like you said. Thank you.
Yeah, there are a lot of cases of cars dying and watches stopping in presence of UFOs. I just would mention this about orbs. For example, Skinwalker Ranch that we've written about extensively, they had multiple different colors of orbs. The white ones that were pretty innocuous would float around, intelligently controlled. Red ones that seemed designed to frighten the livestock and animals, just scare the hell out of them. And then these blue ones, a little bit bigger than a softball, appeared to be made out of glass. They'd get close to the humans and really, really frighten them. I mean, to the point where it would drive people to their knees, way out of whack for how scary the situation really was. So, and there are, as we mentioned to Leslie Kane, who was our first guest, there were studies that were done under the OSAP program that looked at the health effects of close encounters. A lot of them are bad. It may not be intentional on the part of whatever these objects are, whatever the intelligence is behind them, but a lot of folks have had come down with really strange health effects that lasted for a long time. So, yeah, I have to agree, Robert. That was a great story. Thanks for sharing it, but you might have been lucky to get out of there intact. We're going to east of the Rockies. John in Cleveland. Hi, John. You're on with Paul Stonehill.
The guest, I think, over an hour ago mentioned how the CIA has infiltrated the media to disinform the American public against believing in UFOs. But I think a much more powerful and more strategic motive and objective of the CIA is contained in the findings of the Senate Church Committee and the Congressional Pike Committee at the same time of this mention earlier on the program of CIA infiltrating the media during the 60s. And I think people just looked up a phrase like CIA Operation Mockingbird, infiltrates the media to manipulate public consent for war against Russia, China, etc. And I think that is the real dangerous operations that are being perpetrated by the CIA, the deep state. And you mentioned Richard Belcher was an aficionado of researching CIA orchestration of the Kennedy assassination and the 9/11 inside job. But these things are never mentioned, of course, in the media that has been infiltrated by the CIA. And I think until we begin to look inward of the real dangerous serpent in our midst and its control within many agencies of government, directed against countries around the world to drag us into war against them by demonizing them and spying on us and perpetrating crimes against Americans, I think is what we've got to look at rather than directing fire against Russia, China, or Cuba, or Venezuela, or any other country that has failed to submit to the dictates of the politicians and really crooks and liars in Washington.
Yeah, it's not a bad viewpoint to keep in mind there, John. I would say that Mockingbird was real. I wouldn't be surprised if there are CIA-related operatives who have their own media platforms dealing with UFO and related issues right now. Paul, I can understand how Russians would view the CIA and Russian KGB would view the CIA the same way we view KGB. But have you ever come up against something like that, either from KGB or CIA, trying to influence media or influence you?
No, I don't really care about the CIA. They do their job as well as the KGB was doing their job. They spy on each other. When it comes to ufology, I believe there were CIA operations in Central Asia in 1940s, just like the KGB operations here. And I don't know. I am a refugee from the Soviet socialist totalitarian state. I have deep sympathy for people from Cuba who escaped the same putrid reality. So let's put a dot right there. I don't want to get into politics. My job is strictly research of Soviet and Russian ufology. I don't get into, who does what and this and that. This is what I wanted to say. And in all my conversation today, I didn't talk about CIA, only except to the point that they spy on the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union spied on the United States, and there is China too. So let's move on to UFO subjects.
Okay, all right. We're going to the wild card line, Jim in New York. Hi, Jim. Good morning. You're on with Paul Stonehill.
Hello. Thank you for taking my call. I'd like to ask the guest, does he know anything about, since you're speaking about psychic warfare, the Russian technology using psychotronics, with laser-fired psychotronic weapons integrating with psychics against any enemy, be it us or anyone else?
I mentioned of course, if they have the capabilities, they would use against their adversaries and vice versa. And all we know is that they had conducted research and they used it for espionage, allegedly, and for protection of the Soviet state assets and facilities, just like any other country would do. If I knew more than that, I wouldn't be talking to George.
Okay, thank you, Jim. We're going west of the Rockies. Michael in Santa Fe. Hey, Michael, welcome to Coast to Coast.
How are you guys? Very nice to hear your program this evening. I wanted to ask you both if you had ever heard of a gentleman by the name of Robert Petro, who lived in Midtown Manhattan, and like Edgar Cayce, was considered to be one of the greatest living psychics in the world. He had an office at 56th and Broadway at the base of Central Park, and he took a select group of private students up into the Adirondack Parks, where he lived above Lake George, and he would train people to do exactly what it is that you and your guest are talking about this evening.
It doesn't ring a bell with me, the name. Do you, Paul? Do you know that name?
No, not at all. Sorry.
No. Michael, I've never heard that name. I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, you're going to find very little information about him because he did it that way on purpose. But I grew up in Connecticut, and by the power lines where I was living near Woodbury, Connecticut, it's called the Burries. There's Woodbury, Southbury, Roxbury, and there's a tremendous amount of garnet and iron, and revolutionary cannon were made there that were used in the Battle of Castine. They were drug all the way up to Nova Scotia and to fight against the English. But I think if you look into Robert Petro, you might find one YouTube video about him. But it's a fantastic program this evening, and I'd just like to thank both of you gentlemen for talking about these subjects.
Thanks for the call. We got about 2 minutes before we go to a break. Let me ask you, Paul, we've never talked about poltergeist type activity. Has there been much official interest in something like that? I'm wondering in the context of like Skinwalker Ranch, where we have multiple different kinds of paranormal phenomena, UFOs, poltergeist activity, cattle mutilations, Bigfoot and cryptids. Any place like that in Russia? Anything that the official Russian government would have looked into?
If they would look into this officially, they wouldn't tell us. But one of the places is the same Dagestan I told you listeners about a few hours ago. There was a very interesting case, very, very interesting case of poltergeist 10 years ago. On September 1st, there was a fire that started out from nowhere, and things kept going, being lit afire. And what the description was that the fire was strange. It was unusually small, light in color, and did not burn hands. And this was studied by the emergency ministry officials and so forth. Nobody could find out any rational explanation for what happened. But the daughter of the family, Aminat, she had a premonition, which was very interesting to me, about the old man who came to her in her dream and told her that the family has to move up and leave, otherwise the whole house would burn down. And the family left because they didn't want any misfortune to follow them. And they all left, and they were not too fortunate because they were poor. But those who want to ever study it or visit, it was in the village of Chabanmahi in the Buynaks region of the Republic of Dagestan in Russia, September 1st, 2013. In my land of my birth, Ukraine, we had this number of cases too.
That's a heck of a case. Thanks for that call, and thanks for the answer. We'll be right back with more. We have one segment remaining with my guest, Paul Stonehill. He has a depth and breadth of information and knowledge about UFOs, USOs, and related phenomena from Russia, the former Soviet Union, China, that part of the world that we don't hear a whole lot about. We'll get to as many of your calls as we can. Still got room for a couple more if you want to tune in. We'll be right back with more Coast to Coast AM. Our final segment with Paul Stonehill. Let's take some calls. Bill in Los Angeles. Good morning, Bill. How you doing?
Hey, Georgia. Looks like all hell broke loose during your hiatus.
What do you mean? Oh, all the UFOs, yeah.
Yeah. Like that is like 1952 deja vu in both good and bad ways.
Yeah, yep. That's what I get for taking some time away.
Yeah. You and Paul mentioned American debunkers, and I hope to hear your feedback at some point on my third and final on-air encounter with alleged scientist Seth Shostak on Dory's program on February 6th at about 11:40 p.m. when he debunked all the data from what he tellingly referred to as the TikTok Navy video by saying military radar and video cannot determine speed or distance of tracked objects, which might come as a surprise to the Navy and Air Force pilots, including my late father, who was an Army Air Force's reconnaissance pilot in World War II. I mean, if this guy works for SETI, it's no wonder they never find anything.
Good grief. Oh, my gosh. Yeah, that's very telling. Wow, I'm sorry I missed that. I'm going to have to look for that online.
Hello?
I think we lost Bill there.
Okay.
Bill, you still
Hello?
there, Bill?
Yeah. You still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Why would any reporter accept the U.S. government's story that a private research company deployed self-propelled metallic octagonal objects with instrument jamming capabilities at 40,000 feet right next to civil aviation routes, carrying thousands of potential crash victims, which the government originally stated was the rationale for shooting down the objects? And what company would take on such liability either with or without government authorization? This story is a wall-to-wall fabrication.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interesting angles on it. I mean, we shot them down. We don't know what they are, but we know for sure they're not extraterrestrial. And some of the reports were exactly what you said, that there's some jamming and electronic capabilities. Others said that they were just balloons floating with the wind. Paul Stonehill, let me get your take on the media reports about these objects that were shot down over the last 2 weeks.
Well, the media, I really, I despise most of the media, and their coverage and how they cower and before powers that be. What I want to tell you, what I see is happening, guys. Either it's the boy who cried wolf situation, that maybe the powers that be expect us to hear these stories about balloons, and with time forget about it, while the bigger stuff is happening all around us, or the powers that be are in complete panic and they feverish attempts to show that they're doing something, that they control the situation, but they do not control anything, just like Moscow didn't control anything in 1982 when a UFO appeared over the nuclear silo and disabled the connection to Moscow. So this was in the SEPCA program too. It's all the same. Decades go about, the governments are not controlling the situation. So they can shoot down balloons. They can come up with all kinds of explanations. They're not controlling it. UFOs and USOs are out there.
Bill, thanks for the call. I'm going to have to look up that exchange you had with Seth Shostak. That sounds like it's a must-listen radio. We're going to the wild card line. Wayne in Tacoma. Good morning, Wayne.
Paul, I read an article that came from the CIA. It's a CIA download on UFOs, 250-page report. It says that after Mikhail Gorbachev dissolved in 1991, the KGB top secret intelligence administration, a lot of material from that department found their way abroad, in particular to the CIA, as reported by the authoritative magazine Canadian Weekly World News. U.S. intelligence obtained a 250-page file on the attack by a UFO on a military unit in Siberia. The file contains not only many documentary photographs and drawings, but also testimonies by actual participants of the events. One of the CIA representatives referred to this case as a horrific picture of revenge on part of extraterrestrial creatures, a picture that makes one's blood freeze. According to the KGB materials, a quite low-flying spaceship of the shape of a saucer above a military unit that was conducting routine training maneuvers. For unknown reasons, somebody unexpectedly launched a surface-to-air missile hitting the UFO, and it fell to Earth not far away. The 5 short humanoids with large heads and large black eyes emerged from it. It stated that the testimonies by the 2 soldiers who remained alive, that after freeing themselves from the debris, the aliens acquired a spherical shape. The object began to buzz, and the spheres grew bigger and exploded by flaring up with an extremely bright light. At that very instant, 23 soldiers who had watched the phenomena turned into stone poles.
Okay, Wayne, I'll tell you what. Let's hold on. That's why
the debunkers have a field day with all this. This report came from a tabloid from Ukraine, from the little town of Tarnopol. That the CIA would even pay attention to this BS does not make me happy about their capabilities. You will hear a lot of BS about KGB chasing mummies in Egypt or alien races and all this. The KGB was studying UFOs only because they had to, as part of their protection of the motherland's assets and facilities. They were not happy about studying UFOs, and we already said General Sham in 1991, he turned over 124 pages of information to Pavel Popovich. How much they're hiding, I don't know. How much of what they're hiding the CIA has information about, we don't know. But all this, please be very careful when you read tabloid stuff from Canadian weeklies or others about KGB and UFOs. On my channel, I have a number of videos that shows the interaction and the study of Soviet military, Navy, and the intelligence services of UFOs and USOs. And also modern times, because we don't want to delve all the time in the Soviet Union. In my channel, I have videos based on information released by top young Russian scientists who is the graduate of the Mazhaysky Space Academy Institute in St. Petersburg, which was twice attacked by terrorists recently. I don't know why. This is the institution that produces GRU officers and top space intelligence operatives in Russia. He releases very interesting information, including Werner von Braun that we wanted to talk about, and others. They are interested in UFOs and USOs just like are the Americans, and they exchange information. Some information they release, it's very interesting. They have bright, young minds who work on this subject. So maybe in the future we'll be finding out more. But I'm keeping an eye on what's going on. I want to thank you for your call about this, but to underline, this is a BS story.
Thanks, Wayne, for the call. West of the Rockies, Carlos on Oahu. Hey, Carlos, good morning. How's it going?
Aloha, George. Paul, I wanted to know, are you familiar with the top secret 1973 Jupiter Project Skylab mission?
No.
You're not familiar with it?
No.
It was, at the time, it was classified in top secret in the United States, but the Russians knew about it because when I accompanied President Nixon to the Kremlin in 1974, it seems as if everyone knew about the mission in Russia, and the mission has never been reported to the American people.
What is it?
It's part of the United States Air Force secret space program.
I don't know about everybody in Russia who knew. Maybe in some village, was not privy to it. But I assure you that in the Soviet Union, as you call it, Russia, people knew only what the government allowed them to hear and what we could hear from, listening to broadcasts when we were able to, and from talking about each other. Nothing like that was known to me.
Secret space program. You traveled with Nixon to the Kremlin? Carlos?
Kremlin. It was the Kremlin people who knew all about it.
But you traveled with Nixon at that time?
Yes, I did.
In what capacity?
As a special liaison, goodwill ambassador. I was the first officer on that mission. Carlos.
Carlos, we're going to have to hear more about that at some point. Thanks for the call. First-time caller, Antonio in Michigan. Welcome to Coast, Antonio.
Thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I got a short time. I'll just put it this way. CIA did have control of Project Blue Book, but then they retired. It was, I don't know his name. I think he was Cuban CIA agent. But anyways, the billionaire Bigelow has taken over all of that investigation. And you can Google this, He's in charge of all of the investigations because Russia, China, Italy, France, all of these countries have been trying to gain intelligence on, down ships or, whatever, from people and everything like this. They're all gathering this information because this is what brought about the computer age, cellular phones and all that is what was retrieved back, way back in time,
Bigelow, Bigelow. That name rings a bell here in Las Vegas.
He's literally in charge of it all now.
Yeah. Well, he was. He was in charge of a program that was called OSAP that was run out of the DIA. He also controlled NIDS. He was the recipient of all the FAA UFO reports for a number of years, but he's moved on. I mean, he's spent more money funding private UFO research than any person in the history of the world, but he's no longer active in that. He's created something called BICS, the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. Still interested in UFOs, but doesn't have as deep an interest as he once did. But thanks for the call, Antonio. Try one more call in. Carl in the Bronx on the wildcard line. Hey, Carl.
Yes, thank you, George, for taking my call. And Paul, I think Bigelow also owned the Skinwalker Ranch.
He did. Yep.
Yes,
he did.
He owned that ranch. But my question is that you mentioned about the Yeti before in the show, and there was always this talk about in the Tibet, the Himalayas, and many of the areas that Paul mentioned. Has ever the subject have come up about Shangri-La, where there was this advanced civilization that lived in this world where the people never grew old, and expeditions that were sent in the past to look for Shangri-La, they encountered the Yeti, as well as finding footprints in the snow as they, moved through the mountains looking for Shangri-La. Has that subject ever come up about Shangri-La?
We, George and I talked a number of years ago also about the Shambhala and the Belavodia in Russian, that magnificent secret land in the Tibet, allegedly in the Tibet mountains. And it's very interesting that you said people who do not age. This is going back to the Kievan Rus, the pre-Russia, pre-Ukraine state, and there was an expedition that was sent at that time to the land of Shambhala, and one of them came back, one of the expedition members, and he never aged. Everybody else around him did. He told very interesting stories. Now, if you're talking about the Bigfoot, the Almasta, Yeti, yes, there have been sightings all over that area in Nepal, in the Tibet, Himalayan, yes, and in the Soviet parts as well. How it's connected, I'm not sure, but it's out there. But what's interesting, and I want to insert it, Mikhail Demidенko, who was one of the most interesting writers in the Soviet Union at the time, he was involved in paranormal research to the best of his abilities. He spoke fluent Chinese, and I recall I corresponded with him, and in even his books he put stories of how in the 1950s, while in the area, he was told by the Mongol monks, who some of them spoke Russian, about the red Chinese, finding strange giants, sleeping giants, and gutting them, killing them in the process, and sleeping giants of the Tibet. But that's not all they found. Tibet is an excellent subject to talk about, as well as Mongolia and all that. I have the videos on my channel, but maybe one day I'll come back and we can dedicate more time to this subject. Very interesting.
Yeah, I've read a bit about Shambhala, and the Dalai Lama has been quoted about it as being a real place, but it's something that exists in an alternate reality or a parallel universe where the monks, the Tibetan monks, anyone who achieves perfect karma could access it, could go there either mentally or spiritually. And it is a wondrous place, apparently, and sometimes it appears in this reality, but it's not some place you can march to or find hidden up in the mountains. It's a place that can only be achieved in another way. Is that your understanding, Paul?
Some of it. People try to get to it, like Nicholas Rerich, and there are stories, legends of those who actually were able to get there, the Belavodia, Shambhala. So, what you say is right, and also there are actual accounts of people who got there, but I'm not sure if they came back. We have that, but we also have the underground kingdoms in that part of the world, and we talked about it as well.
Carl, thanks for the call. So, Paul, for you, are the people in Ukraine, in Russia, are they able to access your stuff, or there are limits on who can see your YouTube channel?
Nowadays, it's much more difficult, but at the same time, they know about my work because my book was translated into Russian, and they studied it. And if they need to find me, they know how to find me. And I'm in touch with the Russian UFO researchers as well. And Ukrainian Novosti Ufology is a very cool site from Ukraine. And recently, I used it, for example, their information about the 1988 case in Armenia, Soviet Armenia, when they spotted UFO over Turkey and how they reacted. So we exchange information. I find ways to go, and I have to applaud UFO researchers in Belarus, in Ukraine, in Russia, and even Central Asia, who are still active.
That's great. Hang in there. Paul Stonehill, always great to talk to you. I'm going to come see you, and we can plot our conquest of ufology in China at some point, if you don't mind. Okay. All right. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I hope people will check out your YouTube channel. It's just excellent.
Thank you.
All right.
Good night.
Thanks also to my earlier guest, Leslie Kane, and to my colleagues there at Coast to Coast, Michael Cosio and Donna Walker, Lex Lone Hood, Dan Galane, Chris Boros, Lisa Lyon, George Norrie, and Tom Danheiser and their team. I'm George Knapp. I'm back next Sunday night. Good night, everyone.